Hi, I'm food and drink writer Ton Vin, here to tell you about a new podcast from KUOW and the Seattle Times. It's called Seattle Eats. I'll be your host and personal guide across our vibrant local food scene. So let's eat. Our first episode drops Thursday, September 19th on the KUOW app or wherever you get podcasts.
This is Soundside.
Hearing static when you enter a tunnel in the middle of a fascinating story? Hanging out in your driveway to catch the end of a report? We've been there. With the KUOW app, you can listen to your favorite programs anytime and anywhere. No driveways required. Let's get going. Download the KUOW app now, available for iOS and Android. You're listening to Soundside. I'm Diana Opong. Yesterday on the show, we talked about drug exclusion zones in the city and the impacts that they can have on the lives of people struggling with addiction. This was ahead of a scheduled city council vote on whether to establish zones that target illegal drug activity and sex work. Well, last night, the vote happened, and in an 8-1 decision, the Seattle City Council voted in favor of 2 ordinances. So one creates stay out of drug area zones, or SODA zones, in 6 areas of the city. A Seattle municipal court judge can now order people who get arrested for drug-related crimes to steer clear of these zones or face a gross misdemeanor charge. The other establishes a stay out of area of prostitution zone on Aurora, also known now as a SOAP zone. And the zone is between Aurora Avenue North from 85th to 145th Street. This new SOAP ordinance also reinstates a prostitution loitering law as a misdemeanor, and it creates a new gross misdemeanor offense promoting loitering for purposes of prostitution meant to target sex traffickers specifically. Supporters argue the SOAP ordinance will help break up concentrations of sex trafficking and curb-related crime, including gun violence on and near Aurora Avenue. We were scheduled to speak to Seattle City Council member Kathy Moore, who was the lead sponsor on the SOAP bill, right after the vote. But her staff canceled that interview shortly before, and we are waiting to hear if and when we'll be able to be rescheduling with her. In the meantime, we want to know what the new ordinances will mean and how they'll be enforced. KUOW reporter Amy Radil covers politics and law enforcement, and she was reporting on the city council vote late last night. She joins me now. Amy, thanks so much for being here, especially on such little sleep.
Hey, my pleasure.
So I mentioned earlier that the city council passed the SOAP and SODA bills with an 8-1 vote. A lot of people showed up in person and virtually for the public comment period. You were at the meeting last night. Can you give us a sense of the tone of the room and what you heard from members of the public who were both in favor of the SOAP bill and against it?
Sure. Yeah. The supporters talked about things, people who live near Aurora talked about their fears, their homes being shot up on a couple different nights this summer. Residents in general feeling like crime and disorder are extreme right now. And they also described seeing women, especially on Aurora Avenue, who seem to be in terrible distress, clearly being trafficked. And then the opponents, who I would say were the majority who gave public comment yesterday, they don't put credit in the council's stated focus on traffickers and sex buyers. Basically, their statement that the legislation will play out differently from the loitering laws we've had in the past. The critics said there's no data to support this move, and they fear that these kinds of laws will be used to profile and discriminate against some of the most vulnerable people in our city. The tone was angry and snarky at times. One critic mocked the council as the equivalent of anti-vaxxers who, quote, claim to do their own research.
These bills are on their way to Mayor Bruce Harrell's desk as we speak, and he is expected to sign them. So let's talk a little bit about the SOAP bill first. What will it establish? And Amy, explain how it's different from the old prostitution loitering law that the city council repealed back in 2020.
Yeah, the SOAP bill will reestablish and revise that loitering law that the previous council repealed. The old law was mostly enforced against women and girls who were selling sex rather than the buyers. And the council members who nixed it in 2020 said it had disproportionately harmed people of color. The new version will bring back prostitution loitering as a misdemeanor, with police being encouraged to focus on the buyers of commercial sex rather rather than the victims of sexual exploitation. And then it's kind of a package of legislation because it actually creates a new gross misdemeanor law called promoting prostitution loitering. So this is about repeatedly driving someone to a known prostitution area or surveilling someone engaged in prostitution loitering. So basically pimps or traffickers, that's the focus of this new law. Proponents say that it will help police focus on them based on those observable behaviors without needing to collect as much evidence and testimony that can be really hard to bring in these cases. So here's Councilmember Kathy Moore.
We create an entirely new law called promoting loitering for the purposes of prostitution, and we make it a misdemeanor, and we base it on the observable behavior of the exploiters, of them monitoring, surveilling, shouting at, directing, transporting individuals to the Aurora corridor. And we have this behavior on video.
And the city attorney's office provided some figures for how frequently in the last several years there have been felony cases against people who are accused of promoting prostitution. So basically pimps, people who are expected to be the focus of this new city gross misdemeanor. The felony cases are rare because the victim needs to cooperate with the investigation and testify against them. It's a very hard case to bring. So basically they said since 2019, there's usually been basically a handful of these cases every year, ranging between 3 to 5 or 6 of these cases. So it'll be interesting to see how frequently this new city law is used against people accused of being the traffickers on Aurora.
This bill also sets up an exclusion zone along Aurora between North 85th Street and North 145th Street. What kind of enforcement power does that exclusion zone give the city or law enforcement?
Well, it'll give judges in Seattle, municipal court judges, the ability to issue these exclusion orders to sex buyers if they're arrested for prostitution loitering, and then to the people arrested for promoting prostitution loitering. So this is the zone where those exclusion orders are going to apply. Someone's been arrested, let's say, as a sex buyer. The judge will have the ability, even if you've just been arrested, you don't have to necessarily be convicted at that point. They can order you to stay out of that zone. If you return to that zone, police can arrest you on the new gross misdemeanor of violating the SOAP order. Councilmember Kathy Moore, the sponsor, did seek input from organizations that work to assist people caught up in commercial sexual exploitation on Aurora. But I think the diverse public comments that we heard, as she said yesterday, all of these groups in Seattle are not unanimous in their views. There are differences of opinion among these organizations, so that's added to the tensions. She did amend her bill so that sex workers cannot be subject to these SOAP orders. So that is now a hard line that she added as it's been considered. But people who are accused of being sex workers can be arrested for loitering. She said in those situations, she wants them to be sent to an emergency receiving center rather than to jail. And she has promised that the city will move money around to fund that, even with the current budget shortfall that the city's facing.
What about the soda zones? Are they going to be enforced along the same lines, or are there differences in how drug-related soda orders will be ordered and enforced?
Yeah, they give a similar power to the court. So, again, a judge can issue an order banning someone from, now we're going to have 6 different zones in our city. So the person could be arrested, not yet convicted of a crime related to drug activity in one of these zones, and the judge will tell them to stay out of that area. And if they return, it could be a gross misdemeanor. So just to be clear, my understanding is the person would be banned from the one zone where their behavior occurred, not all of these, which was a question I had yesterday. So people may or may not be aware that the number of zones was expanded as it was deliberated on by the council to 6. Diana, we are actually, I noticed on the map, we're actually in one of these new zones here in the University District. It includes part of the Ave. So people around here could potentially be banned from being on the Ave if they're arrested for these other kind of drug-related offenses. And the big concern in the past was, you might be making it impossible for people to access legitimate things like social services in that neighborhood, family, other needs. The supporters of these loitering loitering laws say they've learned from that example, but I think that will be a big area of scrutiny for how these soap and soda orders are applied as they go forward. Councilmember Tammy Morales was the only no vote on these new orders yesterday, and here's what she had to say.
And while these bills may scratch an itch to feel like council is doing something to address public safety, to claim that these laws will address any of these problems is dangerous, and it is the epitome of performative.
I think it's a little maybe unfortunate that both of these bills were kind of bundled together before the council, because the focus on prostitution on Aurora got so much more attention and bandwidth. That legislation was a lot more complex. These new soda zones didn't really get as much scrutiny from at least, from the public comments that I heard. But there is a lot of tracking required. So these orders, hopefully we'll get a good sense of how they're being used as it goes forward. And council members have pledged to make changes if problems emerge with them.
During the public comment period, the city heard from several community members who live in the surrounding neighborhoods around Aurora about gun violence. You mentioned earlier people being concerned about their houses getting shot up. This is a bill about prostitution, though. So how does gun violence fit into the larger struggle over creating the exclusion zone? And what do critics have to say about this?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because the gun violence obviously is so concerning, and it kind of hovered as this kind of worst potential harm that could happen from the disorder on Aurora. So there was a lot of emphasis or allusion to it during the discussion. But then the critics were saying, hey, council, these laws don't address gun violence. Like, why are you focusing on prostitution and drug laws if you're so concerned about the gun violence on Aurora? Loitering laws won't fix that. And Councilmember Moore's response was that the gun violence is symptomatic of how lucrative the sex trafficking on Aurora is. And the city attorney's office put out an estimate based on reviewing video at one location. They noticed that there were about over 100 stops within 8 hours, about 20 different pickups of sex workers. So they're estimating based on that there are basically, hundreds of pickups per night and maybe more than 1,000 traffic stops of people due to the prostitution on Aurora. So Councilmember Moore's response is we need to disrupt this trafficking business that the gun violence is resulting from.
Got it. The gun violence is resulting from the sex trade in that area. These bills are not law yet, but they are on their way to the mayor's desk, and his office has signaled support. There's still a lot we don't know, Amy, about how these ordinances will be enforced. What will you be keeping an eye out for as the city prepares to enforce these exclusion zones and new prostitution loitering laws?
I think there's just a lot of questions about with police staffing at the Seattle Police Department being so understaffed. How could they possibly use another law that addresses, lower level crime? But SPD put out a statement saying that they do support this legislation because they said it provides greater opportunity to interrupt cycles of significant public disorder, and especially in the case of the soap orders, the violence associated with human trafficking. So I've heard them say this could, allow for a brief disruption, at least in certain criminal behavior. And they said that, staffing continues to strain the department, but SPD appreciates any tools like this one that could help them deploy with greater efficiency and effectiveness.
So you just mentioned, Amy, that there's a shortage of resources, bodies, police officers specifically, and if I'm not mistaken, Kathy Moore has something in her bill about providing support to people in the sex trade, especially those who are trafficked. But it doesn't sound like there's a funding model for how that's going to be taken care of.
So this legislation does not contain funding, and they were very, emphatic about that. But they said the budget process is where those funds will be discussed and appropriated, and that's coming in they said next week the mayor is going to be presenting his budget, then it will go to the council. And despite the budget shortfall that has made a lot of people, concerned and skeptical, like how can you really say you're going to have new services or additional help for people? Kathy Moore yesterday was pretty specific that she said we will move money around because she wants to fund this emergency receiving center for people who could be arrested for loitering on Aurora.
Amy Radil covers politics and law enforcement here at KUOW. Amy, thanks so much for being here and helping sort of break down this complex issue.
Yeah, you're welcome.
As Amy said, the council passed the legislation by an 8-1 margin. But in the city council chambers, it has faced intense pushback during public comment for weeks. My next guest has been advocating against this legislation and argues that the establishment of this soap zone will be counterproductive and harmful to sex workers. Madison Zach Wu is an organizer with Strippers Are Workers, a dancer-led organization that has advocated for reforming working conditions in adult entertainment businesses. Madison, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
You were at last night's city council vote. What's your reaction to the outcome of the vote?
It's pretty stunning and upsetting just because the passage of this bill feels incredibly undemocratic. So the last 3 hearings, there has been very, very clear majority of folks coming out to testify in opposition. And yesterday, it was at minimum an 80% of folks were testifying in opposition, asking for the bill to be pulled. Additionally, there's over 60 organizations, and I'm not central staff, so this is just based on like my network. Over 60 organizations were opposing this, and Councilmember Moore was only citing 2 organizations supporting, and then, a couple individuals in the SPD. So how they passed this, I just don't get it.
Are there any advocates on the city council that represent and or recognize the work that Strippers Are Workers has done or is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Councilmember Morales and her office has been reaching out for comments and additional research and also just connection to anti-trafficking organizations so they can build those relationships. I think that there was an element of trying to use Strippers Are Workers, our name, what we've been building off of against us to like discredit our stance. But, the reality is like we passed state legislation that was rooted in anti-trafficking and decriminalization efforts. And there's so many folks in sex work who work in satellite forms of sex work.
And we want to make sure to add that Tammy Morales was the one no vote. This is not the first time Seattle has enacted a soap ordinance. Back in 2020, the city council voted unanimously to appeal a soap ordinance because of the disproportionate impact on people of color. Seattle City Council member Kathy Moore, the lead sponsor of the new soap legislation, says this law is different. Unlike the past soap ordinance, this one is focused on punishing buyers and promoters and not the sex sellers. What do you make of that argument?
It's categorically untrue. So prostitution loitering in 2020 was repealed and had pretty much exactly the same language as the current prostitution loitering ordinance that she created. It still includes being able to be profiled. It still includes like waving, repeatedly approaching cars. And we also know that laws don't necessarily actually inform how police enforce crimes. Additionally, Kathy Moore created new laws. So she created the promotion of prostitution loitering, which would apply to anyone who might be surveilling, monitoring, dropping someone off that is suspected to be a seller of sex. That means that, a fellow sex worker who is helping you be safe could be arrested for promotion. And on top of that, Kathy Moore also created the soap area ban, and that will apply to buyers and traffickers. But, we still have prostitution loitering, and it absolutely will be enforced. We have been hearing from advocates who are doing direct outreach twice a week on the ground saying that there are people in the sex trade already getting stopped, and this isn't even a law yet.
Comprehensive, up-to-date information about the violence sex workers experience is few and far between. But a 2014 study from the American Journal of Public Health found that globally, sex workers have a 45 to 75% chance of experiencing sexual violence while working. Where do you think work can be done to help address sexual violence on Aurora or in Seattle in general?
Yeah, I am hearing a lot of fear. While I've been organizing folks and doing outreach around this legislation, so many people have come to me saying that they are really scared of being killed. And the reason why they're saying that is because these sort of criminalizing laws means that you don't get to choose if you can keep yourself safe. You can't call for help because you fear arrest. You have to be pushed further and further underground in case, the police do try to stop you. And then you're taking sketchier clients, the ones who are more willing to break laws, or at least the ones who know that you are more isolated. All these things make it so much more likely to experience violence, assault, exploitation, or to be murdered.
So the idea behind this ordinance is supposedly, right, to make people more safe and to reduce the type of sex trade that's happening in some of these areas. And what I'm hearing you say is actually it's potentially making things more dangerous for people in the sex trade.
Yeah. So in sex trade frameworks, there's legalization, which is like regulation and control under the state. And that's how you get like the brothels that we have in that one county in Nevada. And there's concerns about that because there's usually business owners who have more power and they're controlling the labor of people who are selling sex. And this is like something that should really come down to like individual autonomy. There's partial decriminalization, or Nordic, which is what Councilmember Moore is implying that she's doing, that she's only targeting buyers and pimps, but that's not true. Like there is a ordinance in her bill that will criminalize prostitutes, but she's claiming to be under the Nordic model. That also increases safety issues because now anyone who is offering security, even if it is a fellow sex worker, could be criminalized. And then there's just full criminalization where it's like any aspect of it at all, which I would consider Councilmember Moore's bill to be a full criminalization bill. Any aspect of the selling of sex is criminalized. And we have been using these criminalization-based models for so long and they don't work, and we're getting more and more evidence even from Amnesty International or local organizations, Planned Parenthood, that says decriminalization is how we prevent more assault, trafficking, and murder, because it means that people are able to access resources without barriers, without fear of being arrested. And so this is just more of the same. And on top of that, there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences because profiling laws like this one just leads to stop and frisk of some of our most marginalized community members.
So what do you think needs to be done to address sexual violence on Aurora or in Seattle in general if you think this is not the answer?
So many people in the sex trade, community advocates, have been approaching Councilmember Moore for months now, since she started floating this idea, saying this is absolutely a problem. No one should be experiencing violence in this line of work, period. And so we want to see resources for housing, for these outreach organizations that are doing the work, that are providing beds. We want to see trauma-informed interventions that do not take away people's choice and autonomy. We want to use empirical evidence-based solutions too. For example, similar to domestic violence intervention, using police to intervene often actually escalates the violence and increases the likelihood of a victim being killed. And so how do we apply those things and learn from the experts and hear from the experts who have been doing this work for so long? And yeah, those solutions just didn't seem to be listened to.
Now that the soap and soda bills are on their way to Mayor Bruce Harrell's desk, how are organizers, like strippers, are workers, planning to help sex workers on Aurora that will face a heightened level of scrutiny and surveillance during their day-to-day work?
Yeah, there is absolutely going to be a need for community to take care of community. And that's unfortunately still just the reality of our society right now, is people in the sex trade really are going to be taken care of by other folks in the sex trade. And so we will continue supporting those efforts and engaging more, and also looking at engaging the community in a way that can support getting this repealed again. So many folks are living this and experiencing the harms already, experiencing the fear of police. And so the more and more we engage with them, hear their stories, record their stories, I hope that we can bring that to the council when inevitably, in my opinion, some of this data collection that is necessary to review the impacts of this law comes back and shows that it's doing harm. And so I think there's kind of long-term strategy there. Also, doing more public education. We're hearing a lot of folks be really interested in legalization or decriminalization of sex work, even the folks asking for this bill to pass. And so how do we continue those conversations, not only to destigmatize the work, but also to just maybe move that needle forward, see how far we can get with trying to decriminalize this work so that people can really be safe.
Madison Zach Wu is an organizer with Strippers Are Workers. Madison, thank you so much for your time and sharing your perspective and representing your community.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please head to KUOW.org/donate. Oh, and don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org, on the new KUOW app, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm food and drink writer Tan Vin, here to tell you about a new podcast from KUOW and the Seattle Times. It's called Seattle Eats. I'll be your host and personal guide across our vibrant local food scene. So let's eat. Our first episode drops Thursday, September 19th on the KUOW app, or wherever you get podcasts.
KUOW is here to help you cut through the noise of election season. Check out Sound Politics, a new podcast hosted by me, Libby Denkman, and Scott Greenstone. Plus, KUOW's partnership with A Braver Way podcast hosted by Monica Guzman, your guide across the political divide. More at KUOW.org/elections.